Welcome to the Quick Learn session on using Excel to help analyze your gradebook. Is everyone able to hear me? All right, so I'm not seeing anything that people are unable to hear me, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today's Quick Learn session, we'll be covering using Excel to help analyze your gradebook. As I mentioned earlier, this presentation will be just about an hour long. I'll demonstrate some techniques that you can use when analyzing your gradebook, and I'll also give hopefully some new keyboard shortcuts so that while you're in Excel, it makes your time go a little bit faster and help you be a little bit more productive. With that, my name is Tennille Fincham. I'm a technology instructor with KUIT, and with me today I have Susie Johannes, also a technology instructor with KUIT. Susie is going to be helping to facilitate the questions today, so if you do have a question, two ways to pose that. Either type in the chat what your question is, or you can unmute your microphone and ask your question through audio. So two different ways there. If you've never used Skype for Business before, just a few meeting tips here that will help your experience. One, it's best to maximize your window so that you can see as much as possible of my screen. Two, if you're not currently asking a question, we ask that you please mute your microphone, and this will help to just cut down on any feedback that we may have if microphones are left open. And then finally, if you would like to answer your questions through the chat, you will need to click on the chat message icon, which should open up the chat panel and allow you to ask questions and also view the current chat. Also today, you may have seen it when we started the recording, but we are recording today's session. That recording will be posted to our website that has other past recordings. So just so you're aware, we are recording today's session. In the follow-up email, I will send you the link to the recording, and I'll also send you the step-by-step of what I'll be doing today, so you'll have that outline. And I will also send you the actual practice file that I'm working with today, so that if you want to go back and take a look at some of the things we've talked about, you'll have the step-by-step and the practice file there for you. Today, what we're going to be talking about, first, I'm going to start with a little bit of a tour. We'll also talk about how I have, the workbook set up. And then we'll talk about some navigating, selecting, and resizing, hopefully some keyboard shortcuts there that will help working with Excel be a little bit easier, a little bit smoother. We'll also be talking about using formulas and functions to calculate average, highest, and lowest scores. And then we'll also be talking about locating and visualizing scores using some functions. And I'll also talk about something called conditional formatting, which will help to visualize, where students' grades are currently and kind of see the grades against one another. We'll also talk about comparing grades, and then finally we'll be talking about goal seek, which is a way for you to essentially say and tell students what they may need to get on the final assessment in order to get a B in the class or something like that. So that's the example we'll use, and we'll talk about how to use goal seek there. Before we get started, are there any questions? Great. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and open up Excel then, and I'm going to show you just two things really quickly. First, I mentioned that I have the step-by-step. This is what it's going to look like. So as you can see, it's basically my whole script that I'm going over today. So I'll send that to you all. And then I'm also going to send you this practice file that we'll be using. On one tab, we have the practice file that will use the incompleted version. On another tab here at the bottom, I have it says grades complete, and this is the completed information so that you can go back and see, and so that I can show you now kind of what we're working towards. So as you can see here, we have some filled in information with the students' names. We also have at the bottom the average, the highest, and the lowest scores for students. We have some other calculations here to find out the number of students, to find out the percentages based on the year. And then we also have at the bottom here calculations to find out how many A's were received in the class, how many B's, C's, and D's. So I'm going to show you how to set up all of this, but this is what the final outcome is going to look like. Also, I mentioned using conditional formatting. That's what this is here. We see some of the items that are highlighted in red. That's conditional formatting at work in order to point out specific grades that meet criteria. And then same thing here. This is another conditional formatting tool that we'll take a look at. And this allows you to essentially see a visual of how the grades compare to one another. This one in particular is called a data bar. So it looks a lot like a bar graph, so you can visually see comparison of the grades of one another. All right, so going back to our grades start, again, I just want to do just some quick tour of Excel, some things that'll make it a little bit easier to work with in Excel. At the top here, we have ranging from file to view on my screen is the ribbon tab. This ribbon tab contains all of the different tools, all the different functions, formulas, ways to change your page layout, all of that stuff it contains within the ribbon. Now, there is something right above the ribbon that's something called the Quick Access Toolbar. By default, it contains the Save button, an Undo button, and a Redo button. The nice thing about this Quick Access Toolbar, however, is that it can be customized to fit your needs in Excel. So here on the Ribbon tab, if you find a tool that you're using often, let's say, for example, this Wrapped Text tool, I can simply right-click on any tool within the ribbon and say Add to Quick Access Toolbar. That adds the icon of the tool at the top and begins to become sort of a shortcut menu for you. Now, even better than just adding this to the Quick Access Toolbar, if you hold down Alt on your keyboard, and it may not show, it may show here, but you'll start to see these numbers underneath the items. So here I have a number 4 under my Wrap Text tool. Now I can use the keyboard shortcut of Alt 4 to apply that wrap text to any cell that I have currently selected. So this becomes a really powerful sort of customized shortcut menu for you as you use Excel. A couple of other things here as we move down the page. One, we have the name box, and this is going to show what cell is currently selected. So in this case, the cell that I currently have selected is F32, so that can be really helpful when you're entering in information. And then right next to that is the formula bar, which is where you can enter in functions or other content that may go into the cell. Another thing that I want to show you that is also very helpful within Excel, here, if you highlight any series of cells, so I'm just going to highlight here F4 through F19. At the very bottom, here in the lower portion, we actually get some calculations of the cells that we have highlighted. So for example, this shows the calculation of the average of the cells that I have selected. It's also going to show the count and then the sum of those cells. And this can be updated and sort of customized as well. If you click on the lower bar here, you can add in things like the minimum and the maximum. So that can be helpful as well when you're analyzing information within Excel. I'm going to show you actually how to calculate and do the functions, but this is a helpful hint as well if you're working within Excel. Okay, so now when we talk a little bit about navigating, to select a cell, we just click in the center of the cell that highlights that. Here, if you want to move your focus to the right, you can click the Tab key, and that's going to move your focus to the right and select cells to the right. A helpful one to learn is the Shift Tab key, because that moves your focus back to the left. So Tab to right, Shift Tab to go left. Same thing here, you're probably familiar with using Enter, which is going to bring your focus down, but if you do a Shift Enter, that's going to bring your focus back up. Now, you can always use the arrow keys and they will allow you to go in any direction, but the Shift Tab and the Shift Enter are good ones to keep in mind in case you're like on a laptop that doesn't have the arrow keys or something to that effect. Other things here when we're talking about selecting data, you're probably used to, again, clicking in the center of Excel and then clicking to drag down or left or right to select a series of cells. A keyboard shortcut which can be really helpful is to do a Shift Control down arrow key, and that's going to select down to your last line of data. And then continuing on, if you do a Shift Control right arrow key, that selects over to the first empty column of data. So really helpful ones there, especially if you have a particularly long data set or a particularly wide data set to get everything selected. Okay, and then one more other keyboard shortcut here. In order to select the entire worksheet, so we're talking about all of the cells that may or may not have data in it, all the columns, you can click in the space between the A and the 1, and this selects all of the data. So that's another good one there. When we're talking about resizing rows and columns, here we can see, especially with Christopher, that Christopher's name sort of bleeds over into the E column. Not a huge deal right now because we don't have any data in the E column, but if we were, it would start to get truncated. So in order to expand the columns, you can click in between, in this case, between columns D and E. You get sort of a black crosshair. And now if you double click, that's going to auto fit to your longest string of text. You can also do this for all columns at one time. So here we're going to use that nifty thing I just showed you where we can select all cells, all columns at once by clicking between A and 1. And now if we hover between a column and double click, that's going to auto fit all of our columns all at one time. So you don't have to double click, more than once, which can be a little bit frustrating if you have a lot of auto fitting to do. So that may have been just some review, but I wanted to give you just some quick tips about Excel. Before I go on, are there any questions about any of those? Okay, so I'm not seeing anything come up on the chat, so I'm going to keep going. If you do have questions as I'm showing you this information, feel free to post those in the chat. The next thing I'm going to talk about here is something called Concatenate. I guess I should also point out that, this particular workbook, I think this is something that once you export your grades from Blackboard, you get something that looks sort of similar. So this is where this came into play with how we have the assignment 1 written, test 1, assignment 2, test 2. This could be an example from like a Blackboard export that you may get of your grades. One thing I did do here was I added in this new column. So for this example, we have the information of Smith as the last name and James as the first name. There are sometimes when you may want to combine those two cells together. So in this case, in column E, I want to see the information as their last name, comma, space, first name. Two ways you can do that. The first is by using a function called concatenate. So concatenate will allow you to select multiple cells to sort of combine together into one text string. So let me show you how that works. Okay, so I'm in cell E4 here. All formulas and functions have to begin with the equal sign. So equals. And then as you type in CON, the first one that pops up here is concatenate. If you press the tab key at this point, that's going to add this in. So equals concatenate. The other nice thing about typing in a function in this way is it gives you sort of this tooltip. So here we have the function, and then we have the areas of information that we need to add in order to perform this function. So in this case, we need to have at least 2 text strings in order to complete the concatenate function. So our text 1, what's the first bit of information that we want to combine together? Well, for us, the first bit is the last name. So I would just select cell C4. So C4 is the first text to combine. You'll notice here that this is highlighted sort of in bold, and then we have to do a comma. So once I do a comma space, I'm on text 2. So what's the second bit of text that I want to combine together? This in this example is cell D4. So C4, comma space D4. And now if I hit enter, this is going to be close to what we want, but notice how this joins Smith and James together. It doesn't give us that comma space. Well, in order to do that, I actually have to click and do some editing on my function. So here, after the comma space of C4, I need to do another comma space, which tells it to add in sort of a third text that needs to be in this particular function. And here, I have to encase this in quotations. So I have to do a quotation, comma space, quotation, and then comma space. So lots of commas here. Basically, we have take the information in C4, then add in a comma space, then combine the information of D4. So now once I hit enter here, now I have the Smith, comma space James, and that gives me the information. Now I don't have to do this for all the cells below. Instead, I can use something called AutoFill. And the autofill is done by using the autofill handle. So here in the corner of our cell, there's a green filled in box. And once you hover your mouse over that, you get sort of a black plus sign. At this point, if I click and drag down to my last cell here where I want to apply the function and release, it's going to copy that function down and add in the names for the associated cells below that. So that's concatenate using an actual function for that. Now, if you have Excel on a PC and you're using versions 2013 or higher, you can also use something called flash fill. So let me show you how that looks. Let me just Control Z this. I'm just going to clear out the data here. Flash fill requires that you have at least some data typed in. So here I have to have at least the last names and the first name because that's the data that I want to pull together. It also requires that you have the cell where you want to add in flash fill at least somewhat adjacent to that data. And I don't believe that there can be like any empty columns in between. So flash fill is nice because here what I can do is actually type in how I want this to appear. So I want this to say Smith, comma space James. That's the formatting that I want to be applied in this column. And now if I hit enter, again, I have to do Chris Anderson, but notice how as I type in A and D, the rest here sort of grayed out. At this point, if I hit enter, that's going to fill in the rest of that information. So now we have that information flash filled for us. Again, this is on PC only for versions of Excel 2013 and higher. So that's flash fill and concatenate. All right, something else here that we need to do for this particular one is I need to complete filling in this final assignment. So here, we're just going to say that every student got exactly the same, which I know is probably not a likely scenario, but just for the ease of completing this, just because I want to show you the autofill again. So we're going to say each student got 80 points. The points possible for this was 100. And then to figure out our percent, again, we're doing a formula to figure this out. So we want to begin with the equal sign. And here we would say T4 divided by U4. So 80 divided by 100 to get that percent. And now if you press enter, it's going to fill that in. Again, we can select all three of these items and use our flash fill. So here, again, I want to look for the black, or I use the auto fill. I want to look for the black plus sign and click and drag down, and it will fill in that information for me to complete the points possible, percent, and percentage. Next up is finding the average, the lowest score, and the highest score for each of our assignments and tests. So let me show you how to do that. Again, we're using a formula here or a function, which again always needs to begin with the equal sign. Here for average, it's equals average. And now if you press the tab key, just like we did for the concatenate, again, we get those tooltips. So this is essentially telling us that we at least need to have two numbers in order to calculate an average. For us, we want to calculate the average of all the students for assignment 1. So we actually want to click in cell F4 and click and drag down to F19. So we want the average of the values that reside in F4 through F19. Then once we press enter, we'll get that calculated. The lowest score is equals MIN tab. And again, we would just select the cells that we want to find the minimum from. So in our case, that's F4 through F19 and enter. And then the highest score is equals MAX tab. And then F4 through F19 and enter. This is another one of those areas where we don't have to type in equals average equals min equals max for each of the test 1 and assignment 2. Instead, what you can do is copy and paste. And I'm going to show you why in just a second. Here, I'm just going to select cells F21 down through F23 because that's where the functions that I want to copy and paste reside. So I can do a Control C on my keyboard to copy. Click into cell I21 because the next areas that I want to analyze are in column I here. So now if I do a Control V as in Victor to paste, this actually updates to become the average of cells I4 through I19 as opposed to F4 through F19. And that's because we're using something called relative references here. Relative reference pointing to the cells that you want to use. So I4 I through I19, F4 through F19, which will then update to be relative to their new location. So since we pasted those formulas in column I, those formulas updated to reference the I column or reference their new location. We can do the same thing here in L21. We can do a Control V as in Victor to paste. Oh, let me just copy this again. Control V as in Victor to paste. In cell O21, Control V as in Victor to paste. And I believe that's it. So we have our 4 averages, our 4 maximums, and our 4 minimums to kind of compare against for each of the assignments and tests that we held. Are there any questions about this particular, relative references? Does that sort of make sense as how you can copy and paste that over to receive new values? If you need to see the messages in chat, you can click on the chat message button here. So this will open and close that chat window. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything in the chat. I'm going to keep going here. Oh, looks like maybe, great, perfect. Okay, so we talked about the minimum, the average, the lowest score. Let's say at this point, we can really compare our averages. So we have an 85, an 88, a 90, and then on test 2, we have an 80. So this is quite a bit lower than the average for all of our other exams. So as an instructor, I may want to do a few things. I may want to take a look at the exact points and percentages of this to kind of get a feel for how many students got below an 80%, right? To kind of see what the grades are. Okay, 2 ways we can do that. The first way I'm going to show you is actually through a function, and it's the if function. So here I have a column built in here, column R for test 2. And this column, we're going to write a function to display an X next to grades that are below 80% so that we can see visually how many students got below an 80. Okay, so using the if function, here again, we have to begin with the equals, and this is if tab. This function contains 3 different things, so a little bit different than what we've used so far. 1, it contains a logical test, a value if true, so if this logical test proves to be true, what do we want to happen, what do we want to show up, and a value if false. So if this logical test is false, what do we want to show up? Well, our logical test in this case is seeing if the student got below an 80%. So if the value in the cell is below an 80%. So to write that, we actually click on the cell. So if the value in Q4 is what we have so far is less than, and here, since we're using percentages, we want to do a 0.8. So our logical test is equals if, open parentheses, Q4 is less than 0.8. Then we need to write our value of true. So again, to get to the next piece of our function, we need to do a comma space. Our value if true is now in bold. Remember I said if they got below an 80%, I kind of wanted to mark that with an X. Here, we're using text, so it does have to be in quotations. So I do a quotation, X quotation. So if the value in Q4 is less than 0.8, then put an X in the cell. Then we're going to do a comma space, our value if false. If we don't type anything here, the word false will show up in the cell. We can also have this display, maybe an O, or maybe, I don't know, something else that says above 80 or whatever we wanted to do here. In our case, I actually don't want it to say anything, so we do two quotations with nothing in between, and that essentially says display nothing if the logical test is false. And then I do just need to do a close parentheses to complete the function and press enter. Now, this first one's a little bit tricky because our value is actually 87 in Q4, so we get nothing in the cell. But again, we can use the AutoFill to click and drag this to the bottom, and this copies the function down, and now we can see the number of X's beside each of those that are below an 80%. So this can be a really good visual indicator to show you, how test scores are comparing to one another or call attention to specific test scores. Now, I have quite a few students that got below an 80% here. As an instructor, I may decide to give a weighted increase to this to bring up the average of this test. So again, I have another column that I created here called weighted points, where we are actually going to increase by 110%. So I have this weighted increase, and I have the value of a 110% that I'm going to multiply their current score by so that I bump up the average. So here in the weighted points column, again, I want to begin with the equal sign because I'm writing a formula. And here I say equals the points, so 04, times, which is the asterisk sign, 110, so S25. So 04 times S25 will give me that new weighted points. And here, if I press enter, then I get the new weighted points of 96. Now let me show you what happens if we go ahead and auto-fill this down. For this one, what I'm getting is 96 and then a series of zeros. Well, let's take a look. Here, our formula is pointing to the right cell of S25. But if we take a look at the value below that, this is actually pointing to cell S26, which has no value in that cell. So anything times nothing is 0, right? And so that's why we keep getting this. Well, the reason is because we are still using a relative reference of S25. So it assumes that we want this to change its focus down the cells, just like we did when we copied and pasted. For this particular one, that's not what we want it to do. We want to somehow in our formula tell it to always use the value of 110%, which is in cell S25. And we do that by using something called an absolute reference. So an absolute reference, all you need to do is add a $ before the column and a $ before the row number and press enter. Our first one, it's not going to change, but it was always correct. But now if we autofill this down, what you'll notice is each of these is still always using cell S25. So now we're multiplying 07 by S25, which is exactly what we want to happen here. So that's an absolute reference where basically you tell your function or you tell your formula to always absolutely use the value in one specific cell or one specific cell range. Okay, so the other thing here, and this is just something to double check on your grades as well. So here, I have this final grade calculated. This final grade, I just took the values in F4 plus I4 plus L4 plus O4 plus T4. But let's take a look here. We're no longer using the O4 grade, right? Because we gave the weighted percentage. So here we just need to update this to use the S column. So instead of O4, here I would do S4 and enter. And then, to want to fill this down to get the updated grades. We did the same thing here where I just added in all of the points possible to get the final grade. And then the percent is just taking their final points that they have divided by the final points possible to get their final sort of percent here. Any questions about the if function or using an absolute reference to calculate those weighted points? Okay. Another way that you can call attention to grades here is by using something called conditional formatting. So conditional formatting allows you to select a number of cells and define what criteria those cells need to meet in order for them to be formatted in a specific way. So here, I would want to highlight the cells that I want to be formatted. So I would select, in this case, cells Q4 down through Q19. On the Home tab of the ribbon, there's a Conditional Formatting button. And here, I would say Conditional Formatting, highlight cells rules. And in this case, this is sort of the same thing. What do we want to test? We want to see values less than. So highlight cells rules less than. And here I can do the same thing. I can type in 80%. So right, that matches our logical function that we basically just wrote. And then it's going to say, how do you want to format those cells? Lots of options here. I'm just going to stick with the default, which is to format the cells with a light red fill with dark red text. And you can see already that the cells that are below an 80% are sort of being formatted or colored in a different way. And once I click OK, then that conditional formatting is applied. So another really great way to call attention to specific grades within your grade sheet. Now, the other conditional formatting that I had applied in the completed version, let's just do this for this assignment 1 here. So again, select the cells that you want to apply the conditional formatting. So H4 through H19. Conditional formatting, and there's one called data bars. So data bars, and I'll select this orange because that seems pretty easy to see. And you can also expand the width of the column a little bit here. And that gives us sort of the bar graph, which shows us the comparison of those cells against one another. So we can quickly have a visual here to see, maybe John Thomas, that's a little bit lower than what's going on here, for the other data bars. So another good visual tool to see grades stacked against one another for a particular assignment or test. Any questions over conditional formatting? Yeah, let me show you what that looks like here on the side. This is actually, I have the grade calculated already, but I can redo this if you want me to show you. This letter grade is actually a nested if statement. So essentially it takes more than one logical function to say if the value in Y4 is less than 0.89, then display an A. If the value in Y4 is less than 0.79, then display a B. So it's those multiple logical statements sort of stacked together all at once. Let me show you how to write that. Let me clear this out here and I'll show you what this looks like. Okay, so here for our letter grade, again, we would type in equals if tab. And here we want to say if the value in Y4 is greater than 0.89, so that's our logical test, comma space, in quotations A. So same thing we did for that X value. Now, instead of going on to our value if false, since we're doing a nested if statement, we just want to do a comma space if tab. So our secondary logical test. And this is if Y4 is greater than 0.79, comma space, then display a B. Same thing here, comma space if tab y4 is greater than, let's see, 0.69, comma space C. We have one more here. So we have comma space if tab y4 is greater than 0.59, comma space D. Now, for our F value, what we can actually do is have that be our value if any of these prove to be false. So here, we can just do our value of false as being an F. So what we essentially have is if the value in Y4 is 0.89, then they get an A. If it's greater than 0.79, then they get a B. If it's greater than 0.69, they get a C. If it's greater than 0.59, they get a D. And if none of those statements prove to be false, then they get an F. Now, the last thing that we have to do here, since we are working with a nested if statement, in order to close this, we have to close multiple parentheses. It might be a little bit hard to see on my screen here, but these parentheses are actually color coded. So here we have a green parentheses, a purple parentheses, a red parentheses, and a black parentheses. So if we just do one closed parentheses, that closes the statement in the green area. So it only closes this statement. And we have to close all of them. So this will close the purple parentheses, the red parentheses, and then finally the black. So you have to have 4 closed parentheses to close those at the end. And then you can do an enter, and that will fill in the value. And then, we can copy and paste that down. So does that make sense with the nested if statement? Cool. Okay, so just some more functions that you can use here to kind of take a look at your grades, especially when we're talking about sort of the final outcome here of grades. One, a good one to calculate here is number of students. So this one's really easy. Here we just type in equals count tab, and this actually counts the number of records that there are. So it doesn't sum them together, but it counts individually, like whether there's 16 or however many there are here. And again, we just have to have at least 2 values to count. So here, I'm just going to select cells A4 through A19 and press enter, and we get sort of the final count of our students there, which is 16. Another one that's good here is, I'm going to skip the final average for freshman and sophomore really quick. I'll come back to it. But since we're talking about the count, let's talk about how to figure out the number of A's, B's, C's, and D's. Here, we just did a strict count, so just count the number of records. But here, to count the number of A, B's, and C's, we kind of have to combine the count and the if statements together so that we can specifically define criteria that need to be met in order to count that record. So to count the number of A's, it has to be an A. So here again, equals count if tab. And notice here what we have. We have a range and we have a criteria. So what range do we want to count? Well, in our case, our range is where this grade is displayed. So cells Z4 through Z19. And then we want to do a comma space to get to the criteria. The criteria is the criteria that needs to be met in order to be counted. So here, in quotations, we would say A. So count the records in cells Z4 through Z19 if they're an A. And then we can press enter here, and that will give us our value of 5 A's total here. We can do the same thing for the number of B's. So we would say equals count if tab. Our range is Z4 through Z19. And our criteria for this one is B. And enter. And then same thing here for C's and D's, equals count if tab. Let's see, we had Z4 through Z19. And this is a C. And last one here, equals count if tab Z4 through Z19D. So we get our final sort of numbers there of numbers A's, B's, and C's. And, if we wanted to, we could double check this. Here I could say total, just to double check that I have 16 total grades compared to my 16 total students, right? So I could say total. Here, you can do equals sum tab, and I could add these together. So click and select those cells. Here, I should get a total of 16, just making sure that I do have 16 grades for my 16 students. So that can be a good sort of final thing to compare against. The other one here that I have is average final percentage for freshmen and an average final percentage for sophomores. So this particular class, here in column B, I have listed whether they're a freshman or a sophomore, and this could be a good comparison to make to see how freshmen stack up against sophomore, or just kind of to see the numbers against one another. So here, again, we want to do an average if, because we want our average to meet specific criteria. So here we would type equals average if. For the average if, we have three different areas of the function that we need to calculate. One, the range. Two, the criteria. And finally, the average range. So what numbers do we want to average? For us, the range is actually where the criteria resides, right? So here we would select cells B4 through B19, then a comma space. What criteria needs to be met within these cells in order to calculate the average? Well, for us, we have freshmen defined as FRSH. So in parentheses, I would put, or quotations, I would put FRSH. And then finally, our average range. So what values do we want to calculate the average for? Here, I had said the final percentage for freshmen. So here, I would select, Y4 through Y19 and press enter. And I get our final average of 0.834. I can do the same thing for sophomores here for equals average if tab. Let's see, we had B4 through B19. This time it has to meet SOPH for sophomore, right? And then our average range is Y4 through Y19. Enter. Now these right now, this is in the general format. If you did want to bring this up to show this as an actual percentage, we could select the cells here and choose the percentage line. So percent. One thing I do want to make a note of here is when you're working with percentages and you don't have any decimal places shown, this is going to round up to the nearest whole number. If you don't want it to round up to the nearest whole number here, you can click on the sort of flyout menu here next to number, and you can define that there be, 2 decimal places. So see how this is sort of rounding up. We have 83.4. If we do 2 decimal places, it's 83.39. So this can be an important thing to keep in mind as you're using the percentages, specifically, when you add on more decimal points. So same thing here. I could copy that format. I could do the formatting here as well. Percent, fly out, 2 decimal places, and that will show, maybe a more true percentage for this grade. Any questions there on creating these sort of count if and average if statements to kind of get an idea of how students are stacking up against one another, comparing grades, anything like that? Has this seemed helpful so far? Does it seem like something that you would want to incorporate into your grade calculations or analyzing of grade books? Okay. Well, let me show you this one last thing here that I have for you today, and that's the goal seek. just to talk about this particular worksheet, this worksheet just has the student ID number copied over, the last name copied over, and then the percentages for each of the test 1, test 2, assignment 1 and 2. And then it just has this final percent, which is just the average of these numbers. So just the average of the grades here. You may get questions from students that may ask, what do I need to get on my final assignment in order to receive a B in the class? So this particular student here right now they have a 78%, and they may be wondering, what final percent they have to get on their grade in order to get a final 80%. You can use something called goal seek in order to do this. So here, I'm just going to select cell G9 for right now. And goal seek is found under the data tab, and it's found under the what if analysis. So what if analysis and goal seek. For goal seek, we have to define 3 different things. One, we have to say we want to set a specific cell to a specific value by changing another cell's value. So in our case, for this student, he wants to know what he needs to get for an 80%. So our set cell is our final grade here, so H9. Here we want to say the value. They want a 0.89. And then we need to say what cell do we need to change. So what grade do they need to get on their final assignment. So we want to change the value in cell G9. And then we can click OK. So this is going to do some calculations here, and essentially it's going to tell us that in order to get an 80% as a final grade, assuming that these are all weighted equally, I should also say that the student has to get an 88%. And we could do this for, all the students if they wanted us to, or just for the specific students that may, send us an email or ask us after class what grade they may need to get in order to receive a final grade. So that's goal seek, which can be pretty helpful, especially, maybe at the end of your term or something like that. Are there any questions over anything that we've gone over today? We have about 10 minutes left, but that sort of wraps up everything that I wanted to show you today. It's just some additional, formatting things you can use, like conditional formatting or additional functions to use to sort of analyze grades. Are there any questions over anything that we've gone over? Yeah, this recording will be available to everyone. So it'll just be an open link on a website, and I'll send you the link to the website either later today or certainly by the end of the week. Yeah, definitely lots of information. I will send you for sure, this workbook that I worked on here so that you have that. And then, as I mentioned, also the step-by-step information. So I have that all spelled out exactly like I went over today, down to like what cell you need to select. So I'll send that in the follow-up email as well. Well, thank you both for your time today. If you have any additional questions, let me know. You can certainly feel free to reply to my follow-up email message to you. And have a great rest of the afternoon.